Hello everyone, MC Tamer here with a possible new sub-series of tutorials that I'm thinking of calling How'd You Do That? Where I break down a mod feature, going through its scripts line by line, and explaining exactly how it works. In this episode, I'm going to explain how I managed to add functional weapon lights to the game. Of course, this isn't just limited to weapons, and I'm sure the same technique could be used to add a functional headlamp to the power armor helmet, for example. So, as you can see here, the implementation is quite simple and is accomplished with just an activator and two scripts. This first one, AAA SCPT flashlight, is the main script and the one that you'd attach to your weapon or armor. Looking inside, we have two variables, an activation flag and a timer. Then, in this onEquip block, which runs as soon as the player equips the item, we set the activation flag to 1. This tells the game that we want to start running the script. All variables default to 0, so setting it to 1 like this is like flipping the on switch. Next, the game mode block is the meat of the script and will run in a constant loop every frame that the game is running. We check our conditions first. Is the activation flag enabled? And has the player unholstered their weapon? If you're adding this script to an armor, you could probably do without this second condition check, since in that case, it wouldn't really matter if the player's weapon is unholstered or not. Directly below this, we have a second set of conditions to check, which handles the toggling of the light on and off, depending on the player's actions. We check if the player is sneaking, or is the player aiming down sights. If the player is crouched, the isSneaking function will return 1, meaning that this condition is not met, and the game will skip running this block of code. However, this OR comparator makes it so that even if the player is sneaking, they can still turn the light on manually by aiming down the sights. That's what this function does. It checks what action the player is currently performing, and if that check returns 9 for aiming down sights, then this condition returns true and the code block will execute. Now, be aware that a quirk of the engine means that this function that detects if the player is aiming down sights doesn't work well in combat. But in that case, the player can just stand up and stop sneaking to turn the light back on. Now, if all 4 of these conditions are met, we start running our timer. When the timer reaches this particular fraction of a second, we spawn the light. By the way, this number equates to roughly 1/15 of a second, meaning we update the light's position 15 times per second. From my experimentation, this was the ideal setting for several reasons. First, I wanted to keep the number of updates per second low so that it wouldn't be so computationally intensive. The minimum frame rate needed by the human eye to create the illusion of movement is 12 frames per second, but I made it 15 because 15 is evenly divisible by both 30 and 60, meaning that whatever frame rate your computer monitor is set to, we won't get any interrupted half frames. Now, you might think that setting it to 30 or 60 would be better, because obviously more samples means smoother animation. But I found that higher values caused severe flickering, like seizure-inducing levels of flickering. Of course, you're free to play around with it and experiment with different settings if you like. Maybe you're going for a strobe effect. Anyway, once the timer reaches this point, we spawn in an activator. I'll explain why in a minute. So this placeAtReticle function spawns our activator at wherever the reticle is pointed. It spawns 1 copy of the activator with a minimum distance of 0 and a maximum distance of 8,192 game units, which is roughly equivalent to 384 feet or 117 meters away. We then reset the timer to 0 so that the next loop it can start counting up again to this 1/15 of a second. If we forget to reset the timer, then the next loop, the timer will permanently be greater than the 1/15 of a second threshold, meaning that the script will run every frame, which will eat up a lot of unnecessary processor cycles. Lastly, we have to tell the game to disable the activation flag if the player unequips the item, which is done in this onUnequip block, and also when the player drops the item, which is done in this onDrop block. Now, remember how we're spawning this activator every loop? What exactly is that activator doing? Well, we couldn't spawn the light source directly in our previous script because then there's no way to delete the light once the reticle has moved elsewhere. So instead, the spawning of the actual light source is handled by the activator. If we load up the activator record, we can see that it's running its own script. Also, as a sidebar, if you ever need an invisible object that players can't directly interact with, this FX null explosion art mesh is perfect. It's included in the base game files, so everybody already has it, and it also has no collision, so the player won't see an activation prompt on their screen, which could break their immersion. You know, like, press E to activate this invisible, non-physical thing, which would be weird. So anyway, back to our activator. What is its script doing? Again, we have two variables, this time a reference and another timer. This onLoad block runs the instant the activator is loaded into the game. So as soon as it gets spawned by our previous script, the code in this block runs. We declare the myLight reference to refer to the light source that our activator is going to spawn at its own location. This is what the placeAtMe function does. It tells the game spawn this light source, office light, key, neutral, at my location. Now, you can choose whatever light source you want. It doesn't have to be this exact one. In fact, if you browse through this list, this list of light sources, you can see every option available to you in the game, letting you choose different colors, the light radius, how bright it is, and so on. You can also create your own custom one, but that's beyond the scope of this video. Anyway, after it spawns our light source, we then tell it to create a detection event. This is what simulates having the light alert enemies. The create detection event function manually forces a detection event as if the enemy heard the player while the player is sneaking. So here, we're calling a detection event on the player with a sound level of 50. Now, I'm not entirely sure what the sound threshold values are, but in the base game, 100 would be considered a loud event, even though there's no upper limit to the value that you can enter here. So we create a detection event on the player at a volume of 50, and this last 3 indicates what caused the noise. For example, a bullet, an explosion. In this case, 3 just means a generic cause. I think this setting might affect what bark the enemy NPC says in reaction to the detection event, but I'm not 100% sure. Anyway, that's what the activator does as soon as it's loaded. It also has its own game mode block running every frame that the game's running. Again, we start running a timer, and once it reaches this point, we remove the light source. For those wondering, this fraction of a second is equal to that 1/15 of a second that we used in the previous script, plus a little bit to give us some overlap. I found that this reduces the visible flickering that you get if both values are exactly equal. So at this point, we disable the light source to remove it from the world space, and do the same to the activator itself. I should note that it's always good modding etiquette to mark disabled objects for deletion. This lets the game know that we're done with that object, so it's safe to delete it from memory. This helps to combat save bloat by not having thousands of objects left over that aren't being used anymore, but which the game is still expected to keep track of. So yeah, always mark your disabled objects for deletion if you don't plan to re-enable them again later. In our case, we're spawning a brand new light source every single time, not trying to move a constant light source to the reticle's new location, so we need to clean up after ourselves. And that's all there is to it. All you have to do is attach the flashlight script to any weapon or armor that you want, and when the player equips it, it will spawn a light source at the reticle, then disable it again, over and over, 15 times per second. So that's all I have for you today. If you found this video helpful, or would be interested in seeing similar line-by-line breakdowns of other features from my mods, let me know down in the comments below, and I might make a sequel. In any case, thank you very much for watching, and happy modding!